The unfinished hull. My name is Elden Rourke, and I have built boats on this coast for 51 years. I'm going to talk for a while tonight, and I want you to sand that rib while you listen, because idle hands make a man impatient, and impatience is the first thing I intend to take away from you before this night is through. You came to me 8 months ago because your uncle told you I was the best boatwright between the two capes, and because you had heard, wrongly, that I could teach you a trick. There is no trick. I want that said plainly before we go one sentence further, because if you are waiting for me to hand you a shortcut, you will wait until the tide has turned 4 times, and you will still be waiting. What I can teach you is a way of thinking that I did not invent, that no one man invented, that has simply been noticed over and over by people who built things that lasted, and by people who watched their own lives fall apart from lack of it. I learned it the hard way, from a man named Josiah Kettleworth, who apprenticed me the way I am apprenticing you, and who is 30 years dead now, and whose boats are still on the water. I am going to pass along what he gave me, and I am going to be honest about the parts of it that are simply hard work dressed up as wisdom, because I have no patience anymore for people who sell hard work as magic. Here is the first thing Kettleworth ever said to me on my first morning in this same shop, looking at the same unfinished hull you are looking at now. A hull that isn't finished in your head, he said, will never be finished in your hands. I did not understand him. I thought he meant I should draw plans, which is true, but is not what he meant. He meant something larger, and it took me 2 years to understand it, and I'm going to give it to you tonight in less than an hour, because I am old, and I don't want to watch you take 2 years to learn what I can tell you plainly. He meant that before a man builds anything worth building, he has to be able to see the whole of it, finished, in his mind, clearly enough that he could describe it to a stranger, down to the grain of the wood. Most men who fail at things they attempt do not fail because their hands were clumsy. They fail because they never once saw the finished thing clearly. They had a vague wish for a good boat, or a successful season, or a better life, and a vague wish is not a plan, and a mind that has never pictured the finished thing has nothing to build toward. It is like sending a man out to sea and refusing to tell him the harbor he is meant to reach. He will drift competently forever. So the first thing I'm going to ask of you, and I want it done before you sleep tonight, is this. I want you to know, specifically, not generally, what you are trying to build with your life this year. Not, I want to be a good boatwright. Everyone wants to be a good boatwright. That sentence has never built a single boat. I want a specific vessel, a specific skill, a specific standard, something you could describe to a stranger with enough detail that the stranger could tell you, honestly, whether you had achieved it or not. If you cannot be told whether you succeeded or failed, you have not set a goal. You have made a wish, and wishes are what men make instead of deciding. The difference between wanting and deciding. I want to tell you about a woman I knew when I was young, not much older than you are now, named Adelaide Fenn. She kept the ledger books for half the merchants in this town, and she was, by every account, including her own, unhappy in that work. She wanted, she told anyone who would listen, to open her own shop, a proper one, selling cloth and thread and the fine buttons that used to come in on the trading ships. She talked about it for 11 years. I know it was 11 years because I counted the way you count a friend's excuses when you have run out of patience for them and started keeping score instead of arguing. Every year she had a new reason it hadn't happened yet. The rent was too high. Her mother needed her. The trading routes were unreliable that season. She was not being dishonest, you understand. Every one of those reasons was real. That is the trap of it. The reasons are always real. Life will hand a cautious person an infinite supply of real reasons to wait, because life does not owe anyone a moment of convenient timing, and it has never once apologized for that. Then, in her 39th year, her mother died, and at the funeral I was there. I remember this clearly. Adelaide stood at the graveside and said something to her sister that I have never forgotten, because I watched the exact moment a woman's whole bearing changed while she said it. She said, "I am done waiting to be ready." She opened her shop 4 months later, Not because anything about her circumstances had improved. If anything, they had gotten harder, because she was grieving and short on money and entirely alone in the venture. What had changed was not her circumstances. What had changed was that she stopped wanting the shop and started deciding on the shop. And I want you to sit with the difference between those two words, because it is the difference between the 11 years that came before and the 4 months that came after. Wanting is a feeling. It arrives on its own, it fluctuates with your mood, and it asks nothing of you. A man can want something quietly for 30 years and never once be inconvenienced by the wanting. Deciding is not a feeling at all. It is an act, and it has a peculiar property that wanting does not have. Once it is genuinely made, it closes off the exits. Adelaide did not decide to try the shop. Trying leaves the exit open. A man who is only trying has already rehearsed, in some quiet corner of himself, the speech he will give when it doesn't work out. She decided to have the shop, the way you decide to cross a river, rather than deciding to consider the possibility of getting your feet wet. I am not going to tell you that deciding guarantees success, because that would be a lie, and I told you I have no patience for people who sell lies dressed as wisdom. Adelaide's shop struggled its first winter. It nearly closed twice. What the decision guaranteed was not the outcome. It was that she showed up to every hard morning as a shopkeeper solving a shopkeeper's problem, instead of as a woman deciding for the 12th year running whether shopkeeping was really for her. That difference, multiplied across 1,000 mornings, is most of what separates the people who eventually build the thing from the people who spend their whole lives circling it. So here is the second thing I want from you, and it follows straight from the first. You told me last month, vaguely, that you wanted to build your own boat by next spring's launch, a design of your own, not one of mine. I want you to notice that you have been wanting this for a month and have cut exactly one piece of timber toward it. Tonight, decide it, plainly, out loud, if it helps you, with a date attached. Not, I'll try to have something ready. A decided thing has a date. A wished-for thing never does, because a date is the one detail that would let reality prove you wrong, and a man who is only wishing is very careful never to give reality that chance. What you say to yourself in the dark. Now, I want to talk about something that sits underneath everything else I'm going to tell you, and it is the part most men are embarrassed to talk about, which is exactly why I'm going to talk about it plainly. You talk to yourself all day long. Not aloud, usually, though sometimes aloud, and I have caught you doing it in this shop more than once. Every man does it. The question is not whether you run a conversation with yourself. You cannot stop that. No one can. The question is what that conversation says, and whether you have ever once paid attention to it. I want you to notice something about the way you speak of your own mistakes. 3 weeks ago, you split a plank on the bandsaw, a genuine error. Careless, the kind of thing that costs us half a day and a piece of good oak. I watched what you said under your breath when it happened. You said, "Of course I did. I always do this." Not, "I made a mistake." Not even, "That was careless." You said always. You reached backward across your whole life and pulled out a verdict, delivered it to yourself, and moved on as though you'd simply reported the weather. Here is what I want you to understand about that sentence, because it matters more than the split plank ever will. A man who tells himself, "I always do this," is not describing a fact. There is no way to verify always. It is not a measurement. It is a mood wearing the costume of a measurement. But here is the trouble with moods that dress themselves up as facts. The mind does not file them separately. Say, "I always ruin things enough times, in enough small moments, over enough years, and you are not describing your character anymore. You are constructing it." The sentence stops being a reaction to the mistake and starts being the thing that produces the next one. Because a man who has told himself for 10 years that he is careless will, eventually, stop bothering to be careful. What would be the point if carelessness is simply who he is? I am not asking you to lie to yourself. I have even less patience for that than for the salesman. I am not going to tell you to stand in front of a mirror and tell yourself you are wonderful, because you will know it's hollow, and a hollow sentence convinces no one, least of all the person saying it. What I am asking is smaller and harder. Be accurate. I split the plank because I was rushing is accurate, and it is also useful because it names a fixable cause instead of an unfixable identity. I always do this is not accuracy. It is a verdict handed down by a tired, frustrated man who wanted to stop feeling bad quickly, and the fastest way to stop examining a mistake is to declare it permanent and unexaminable. That is the real reason people say, I always. Not because it's true, but because it ends the inquiry. Kettleworth used to make me say the correction out loud when he caught me at it. Not a comforting lie, a corrected sentence. I was careless today instead of I am a careless man. This joint failed instead of I can't do joinery. Small difference in the words. Enormous difference in what a man carries into tomorrow morning. Because tomorrow morning he either wakes up as someone who made an error yesterday, which is nearly everyone who has ever lived, or he wakes up as someone who confirmed, yet again, a permanent flaw. And those two men approach the same bandsaw very differently. So here is the third thing. For the next month, I want you to notice. Just notice. I'm not asking for a miracle. Every time you hand yourself a permanent verdict for a temporary event, and when you catch it, correct it out loud, even if it feels foolish standing alone in this shop talking to yourself. It will feel foolish. Do it anyway. The foolishness fades. The habit it replaces does not fade on its own. I have watched men carry it to their graves. The weight of the extra plank. Now, I want to tell you about the 2 years I nearly quit boat building, because you should know that this trade did not come easily to me either, and because the story explains something about persistence that I have never seen written down anywhere, though I suspect a great many people have lived it without naming it. I was 22, 3 years into my apprenticeship, and I built a skiff for a fisherman named Corwin Addle. It was, by any fair measure, a good boat. It held its line, it didn't leak, it did everything a skiff is meant to do. Addle paid me, thanked me, and that would have been the end of it, except that I noticed walking home that the transom, the flat stern piece, was fitted well but not fitted beautifully. There was a hairline gap where the caulking sat a shade thicker than it should have. No one would ever see it. No one would ever feel it in the handling of the boat. It would never once cause a leak in that man's lifetime. I went back the next morning, before Addle had even taken the boat out, and I asked to redo the transom. He thought I was mad. He told me plainly the boat was fine, and he had no intention of paying me another coin for work he couldn't see the need for. I told him I didn't want another coin. I wanted to redo it because I knew about the gap, and knowing about it and leaving it there was not a boat I was willing to put my name to, even though no one else would ever know. That took me a day and a half of unpaid work, and I want to be honest with you. At the time, it felt like a foolish use of a day and a half. I was poor. I needed the wage from my next job, not more unpaid hours on a finished one. Kettleworth, when I told him, did not praise me the way I expected. He said something I didn't understand for years. You didn't do that for Addle. You did that for the next 100 boats you're going to build, and you won't collect on it for a long time, and most of the payment won't come from Addle at all. He was right, and here is how I finally understood it. 3 years later, a shipping agent named Perrin Voss came looking for someone to build 4 cargo boats on a tight contract, and he asked around town first, the way careful men do. He didn't ask who was fastest. He asked, plainly, who finishes the parts nobody's going to check. And 3 separate people, unprompted, told him about a gap in a transom on a skiff he had never seen and never would see, on a boat that wasn't even his. That contract built my reputation on this whole stretch of coast, and it started with a day and a half of invisible work on a boat I'd already been paid for and already delivered. I don't tell you that story to promise you that every extra effort gets repaid. Because it doesn't, not on any schedule you can predict. And a man who does the extra work purely calculating a future payoff will usually do it badly, because the calculation shows. What I want you to understand is narrower and more honest than that. The work nobody is checking is the only work that actually tells you, and eventually tells other people, what kind of craftsman you've decided to be. The work someone is watching only tells you what you're capable of when you're being watched, which is the least interesting thing about any of us. Most men never do the invisible plank. Most men do exactly what's required and stop, and there is nothing dishonest in that. It is a fair trade, labor for wage, and the world owes such a man nothing further. He will simply, quietly, always be the second man considered, and he will spend a good deal of his life confused about why, and I have watched that confusion eat at men for decades, because they never once connected it to the plank they didn't fix. What fear actually costs? Asked me last week while we were caulking the bow together why I never took on the harbor commission 15 years ago. The big one, the one that would have made me wealthy instead of merely comfortable. I gave you a short answer at the time because we were working. I want to give you the true one now. I didn't take it because I was afraid, and I want to say that plainly instead of dressing it up, because I have watched too many men, myself included, for longer than I'd like to admit, hide fear behind a dozen more respectable words. I called it not the right season. I called it overextending myself. I called it being realistic. Every one of those phrases was a well-tailored coat draped over the same plain fear, that I would take the commission, fail publicly and expensively, and confirm in front of the whole town the thing I privately suspected about myself, that I was a competent tradesman, but not a genuinely great one. Here is what fear actually does, and I have had 30 years to study it in myself, so I will tell you plainly instead of poetically. Fear does not stop a man by standing in front of him and forbidding him to move the way it's drawn in children's stories. It is quieter and far more effective than that. It works by making the safe path look sensible so that a man never experiences himself as having refused anything. He experiences himself as having made a prudent decision. I did not feel at the time like a man who had backed away from fear. I felt like a man who had shown good judgment. That is fear's actual method, not a wall you can see and rage against, but a set of very reasonable sounding sentences that arrive exactly when you need an exit and never announce themselves as an exit. The cost of it doesn't arrive all at once either, which is why it's so easy to miss. It arrives as a slow narrowing. Each time you take the reasonable sounding exit, the next exit gets a little easier to find and a little more reasonable sounding, until a man who was once simply cautious in one hard moment has become, without ever choosing it directly, a cautious man. The caution has gone from being something he did to something he is. And the truly costly part is that this process is nearly invisible to the man living it, because at every single step along the way, he had a perfectly good reason. I am not going to tell you fear is something you can argue yourself out of, because I tried that for years, and it does not work. You cannot out-reason a fear at 2 a.m. It has heard every argument you own, and it simply waits you out. What worked for me, eventually, was smaller and less dramatic than a cure. I stopped asking myself whether I felt ready, because I noticed that question never once produced a useful answer. No one feels ready for the thing that would actually stretch them, by definition, because being stretched is what not ready means. I started asking a different question instead. What is the one action today that a version of me without this particular fear would take? And then I would simply do that action, feeling exactly as afraid as before, because I had finally understood that the fear was never going to leave first and grant me permission. It only ever shrinks after you've acted despite it, never before. I still didn't take the harbor commission, for what it's worth. That ship, so to speak, had sailed. But I took the next 3 commissions that frightened me in the same way, and that is most of the difference between the boatwright standing in front of you now and the boatwright who would have spent his last 15 years explaining reasonably why the timing was never quite right. The company you keep in your own head. Kettleworth taught me something odd near the end of his life that I dismissed at first as an old man's eccentricity and later came to rely on more than almost anything else he gave me. He told me that whenever he faced a decision he didn't trust himself to make well, he would imagine, specifically, how 3 particular people would approach it. Not people he knew personally in every case, but people whose character on that specific question he trusted completely. For patience with a difficult customer, he pictured his own late wife, who could outwait a stubborn man longer than anyone I ever met. For honesty about a piece of work that wasn't good enough, he pictured a stone-faced old harbor inspector named Grieve, who had failed more of Kettleworth's early boats than anyone else in his life, and whom he'd hated at the time, and thanked, later, more than anyone. For sheer stubborn refusal to quit, he pictured his own father, a fisherman who had gone out in weather no sensible man would have gone out in, not from recklessness, but from a kind of settled refusal to be beaten by conditions. He wasn't claiming these people spoke to him, or that anything mystical passed between him and his memory of them. He was doing something plainer, and I think more useful. He was using specific, vivid examples of the exact quality he lacked in the moment, as a way of stepping outside his own tired, frightened, or lazy first impulse. It is remarkably hard to ask yourself, what should I do in a hard moment? Because your own voice is the one that's currently exhausted, currently afraid, currently looking for the easy exit. It is much easier to ask, what would Grieve say about this joint? Because Grieve, in your imagination, is not tired. Grieve was never afraid of your disapproval. Grieve, existing now only as a very clear memory, is free to simply have the standard you wish you could hold yourself to, without the fatigue of holding it. I do this now myself. And I'll tell you plainly who stands in my own 3 chairs because I don't see any reason to be precious about it. For patience, I picture Kettleworth himself on the days he'd let me botch a joint 4 times before he'd even offer to show me the 5th. For honesty about my own work, I picture Adol's transom, not a person at all, just that hairline gap, which has become a kind of standard I hold up to everything I build. And for refusing to quit, oddly, I picture you, 6 months from now, looking back at whatever I do this year, because I find I hold myself to a higher standard imagining a specific young person watching than I ever managed imagining an abstract idea of my reputation. This is not a trick for summoning wisdom from nowhere. It is a plain method for borrowing, temporarily, a version of your own judgment that isn't currently exhausted. Try it the next time you're deciding whether to fix the gap nobody will ever see. What you owe the work before it owes you anything. I want to say something now that will sound to a young man like the least inspiring part of this whole evening, and I am saying it anyway because leaving it out would make everything before it a kind of lie. None of what I've told you tonight works as a shortcut. I have watched men take pieces of this, the clear goal, the corrected self-talk, the extra plank, the borrowed patience, and try to use them as a way of skipping the years of unglamorous, repetitive competence that this trade actually requires. It does not work that way, and I distrust deeply anyone who tells a young person otherwise, because I have seen what happens to the young person afterward. A clear goal does not build the boat. It only aims the years of work you still have to put in. Corrected self-talk does not make you skilled. It only keeps you from quitting before the skill has time to arrive. The extra plank does not guarantee the contract. Most extra planks, honestly, go entirely unnoticed, and you do them anyway because of what refusing to do them would make of you, not because of what noticing them will make happen. None of this is a way of getting something for the wanting of it. Nothing in this trade, or in any trade I've ever respected, has ever worked that way, and I would trust you less, not more, if I told you it did. What I am offering you is not a way around the years. It is a way of spending the years so that they actually accumulate into something, instead of being spent, as I watched happen to men I loved, in a kind of fog of vague wanting, harsh self-judgment, invisible corner-cutting, unexamined fear, and exhausted, unadvised decisions, which is how most people spend their years, not from any particular flaw in them, but because no one ever sat them down on a night like this one and named the pattern plainly enough for them to notice it in themselves. So take the specific goal you decided on tonight and go put in an unglamorous morning on it tomorrow, and then another one the day after. That is the entire remainder of the method. There isn't a 9th part where it gets easier than that. The boat you're actually building. It's late, and you've sanded that rib smoother than it needed to be, which tells me you were listening even when your hands were busy, and that is exactly the kind of attention this trade rewards. I'll leave you with the thing Kettleworth left me with. On the last night he ever taught me anything, though neither of us knew it was the last night at the time. He said that every boatwright is building two things at once, whether he notices it or not. He is building the boat in front of him, which will be judged by strangers, sold or not sold, seaworthy or not, and forgotten within a generation or two, no matter how well he builds it. Because that is simply what happens to boats. And he is building, plank by plank, invisible to everyone but himself. The kind of man who does this work. Patient or impatient, honest about the hidden gap or not, someone who decides things, or someone who only ever wants them. That second boat is the one that actually matters, and it is the only one you get to keep. It is also the only one nobody else is qualified to grade, which is either a great freedom or a great danger, depending entirely on whether you are honest with yourself about the hidden gaps. Go home. Set your specific goal down on paper before you sleep, the way I asked. Not the vague one. The one with a date on it, and the plain sentence describing what you'll give in return for it, because nothing in this trade or any other has ever been handed over for free. And the man who expects otherwise is not really planning. He's still just wanting, dressed up in the clothes of a plan. I'll see you at first light. Bring the plane with the sharp blade. We have real work to do, and no clever words will do a single stroke of it for us.